Okay, just to get started, my name is Mark Lovik, and I'm introducing myself because I normally introduce everybody. Currently, I'm working at IDOT, and I'm working through two companies. I'm working through, I think, Tech Systems and Diversified Services Network right now. But I've done transitions. I'm probably a good person talking about ASP NET MVC because I really hadn't done that much of it until recently, and now I'm buried in it. But it's new enough, and there's still things that drive me nuts. And today, just before we even do anything, I just want to give you kind of a context. If you want to learn about ASP NET MVC, there's a Microsoft website, and they've got videos. They have examples, and they're wonderful. And I'm going to recommend, if you want to follow any of this, go to it. So the question is, what in the heck should I do today when there's all this wonderful material instead of just saying, go online? And so what I'm going to do today is kind of give you an overview, a perspective, try and fill in the gaps in between, and lead people into ASP NET MVC and how it compares to straight ASP NET. So that's what I'm going to try and do today, and we'll see how we do in success. And at the very end, I do want to tell you something. If you can imagine a town in the desert, you know, where it says urban, 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 and all of a sudden desert hits, or like Boulder, Colorado, there's town, 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 all of a sudden the mountains hit and there's nothing. Well, in ASP NET MVC, there's also kind of this frontier, and it's rather abrupt. Microsoft has all these aids, all these wonderful tools, and when it stops, and then you just say, Wild West, go figure it out yourself. And that's not a bad thing to do. But it turns out there's a lot of confusion when you get to that Wild West side of things, and that's what I want to talk about at the very end, and see if we can get a little discussion going. And then that's probably something that's going to go after the meeting. So, to get started then, I have 40 slides. And that's not a threat, but that's to keep things in line. And I've already done some of the introduction. So, ASP NET MVC, what is it? It's a lightweight web tool set. And it implements the MVC pattern, which we're going to talk about. And it generates HTML code. Not ASP controls and ASP junk, but straight HTML code to the client. So if you want to put it on an iPad or an iPhone, you can do that. So this is very different. It's using a lot of the things that ASP NET Forms does, but it's a very different approach and very different set of tools. So the other thing is MVC3 has changed. It's using a lot of the Net4 features. And some of them are a little unusual. Like, for example, you've gotten used to the variant type, right? The strongly typed variant from link queries. Now we have dynamic types. And that's actually being used also. And once in a while, that messes you up in bindings. So for the tools that are used is you need Visual Studio 2010 Service Pack 1. You notice the 2010 is not on the slide. You also need the ASP.NET MVC Tools Update. And then Entity Framework 4.2 just came out in November. But 4.1 or 4.2 also tends to work. And that's not part of really the MVC system, but it's used in so many of the examples, and it's integrated so tightly in the system. It's one of the easier ways to have an integrated web experience with MVC. Other things that are optional, if you haven't tried NuGet yet, or the web platform installer, shame on you. Pretty much, okay. Those of you who know, you know. Those of you who don't, figure it out or ask a question. I'm going to demonstrate Web Matrix. If you don't get that one, whoop. But it's a nice way to get us to understand the Razor syntax today. And it's a little aside we can do. Web Matrix is kind of like dumbed down version of actually writing an app. And it's kind of cool. And it actually led to the Razor syntax that we're using now in Visual Studio. One example is we'll use SQL Compact, and that's part of the Web Matrix system, where you're talking about storing a database in a file and keeping it local. Very different system, and for prototyping things, it's kind of nice. Some of the code first examples tend to use SQL Compact. You really ought to put it on your system if you want to run the demos, but other than that, you're generally not going to make an industrial website with SQL Compact, not unless you can replicate it carefully. And then finally, IIS Express is one of those new tools that came out. So for developers, we don't have to configure for 10 days to try and get Hello World up on a website. So that's kind of our system. Just to do a quick comparison and contrast. On ASP.NET Forms, and I'm just going to say net forms or forms, just so I don't keep saying a lot of those words over and over and over again. And if I say MVC, I mean ASP.NET MVC. So let's just start getting to the idea of, I'll say forms and MVC, you understand what I mean. But on forms, the whole idea was to have a tool system with designers, and the language looks like it. It looks like an automated tools set of language for the markup. The markup is garbage with all sorts of commands. It doesn't read well, but it was good for automated designers at the time. You also have, in forms, you have ASP NET controls. The big, thick controls that have view state, a lot of security, all sorts of other things behind it. And the controls have backing state, right? So you keep, you know, some of the attributes on the system, you know, is the button pressed or not, big, you know, those kinds of things. The other thing is you could set up the callbacks. So if you pressed enter on a text box, they could do a post back. You know, that kind of thing exists on these ASP NET controls. Now in contrast, a couple things over on the right side now. MVC uses HTML controls. There are no ASP NET input kinds of forms, no text boxes and things. It's going to be an HTML straight raw thing. The other thing is you're going to have to know the form tag, because the form tag is going to be one of the keys for doing input. You have to put inputs inside that form. And if we had to write this raw, it would take too much time. So they've got lots and lots of helpers so we can generate code quickly. MVC uses a strongly typed model, or you can use a view model, is one of the things they encourage. You don't have to do it, but we can have a strong type system. We can get IntelliSense from this. It uses kind of a Ruby on Rails inspired design, and that goes even further. You know, the MVC kind of approach, where you want to set things up, you want to use a rich object system, you want to not repeat yourself, you know, the dry kinds of principles, instead of using the designer kinds of things. Now, you don't get a designer experience. You write your HTML, you can do it quick, but you're going to have to kind of look at it in a different form. You don't just design it and pretty it up and do things on the screen and then just wire up your code after the fact. Now, both of them use Internet Information Services and the web stack model. And I want to digress on that a little bit just to put it in context. But after that, it diverges. Okay, all the other stuff you put on top in forms, those special controls, they're gone. We don't care about them. But we're using the rest of IIS and the ASP.NET system. We still can use the ASP.NET security model. The one big difference is we're going to generate pages. We're going to generate HTML, so instead of having a resource you just display as a page, you're generating it, and the route is just a virtual address. So there's a different mechanism to do security. Often what you do is you put attributes on a controller, and if you're not the anonymous, if you're like the anonymous user in terms of your principal credentials, as opposed to an authenticated user, you can on the controller or on the views put in some attributes so you have security implemented. Because now you're not doing the files, you're doing it on your actual attributes, and that's in the controller and in the views. So different security approach, because again, you don't have a thing you're securing in a directory you're securing. You got to do it in a different form. Okay, again, forms has that GUI RAD development and the things around it. Instead, MVC has the conventions and some do not repeat yourself kinds of aids so you can develop your code very quickly. It's meant to be a coder-centric kind of approach. And now MVC has the Razor View engine, which is cool. And it's very, very simple. So the agenda. I got to go a little faster if I got 40 slides today. I'm going to talk about a quick little introduction, some context. I'm going to play with Razor. I think the best way to do it is show you a couple things, do a quick little demonstration, and then from then on, just point you to some links and have you go have fun with it, because it's very easy and you don't want to overthink it. Then I'm going to talk about MVC traditional and how it applies to web. And this is going to be quick, kind of the very top level view of the MVC pattern. I'm going to then split over to ASP.NET MVC and kind of transition this to conventions and very quickly then show you an example piece of code. And this is the code that Alan originally worked on last year in MVC2, translated over. So I shamelessly adapted that. But the good part is, if you ever see his original slides and materials, you can see how 2 and 3 have kind of changed over, and the materials are still relevant. Originally, I had a cute word for utilities, but I'm going to just give you a quick introduction on helpers. We're going to spend most of our time, though, just looking at some of this on the code, and just, there's materials for it. And then scaffolding, if I can do this right, we're going to try and show an example of scaffolding. It's cool because you can generate the initial pages so terribly fast. And then at the end, I'd like to switch over to some data patterns, how you do your data model and the effectiveness of your data model. Things like POCO and unit of work and repository aren't arbitrary things on web pages. They can make your life a whole lot easier, but there's some pitfalls you can fall into. And I think that's where I'd like to end off because there could be some nice discussions there. Because how we do our data, how we do our behavior is that frontier, and there's no prescription from Microsoft. And it turns out there's a lot of confusion in there. And I'm not going to tell you I know every answer on that, but that's a good discussion because everybody's searching that same thing. Talk to Matt, he said he's searching. We've done some searching in the past. And if you look on the web, everybody's going, what? You know, how do you do it? And so the status and futures is talking about what works and what doesn't work right now because it's a good tool. I think it's an effective web tool, but it's not perfect. Okay. Quick overview. This hopefully isn't too bad, but this is to remind you, web forms always hides a lot of this junk. You know, you see it, but you don't think about it. But if you think about it, a client's going to do requests, you know, they're going to do a post back or get the original page, whatever. They're going to do a request, and it goes to Internet Information Services. Based on the path, right, the virtual path compared to your root address, IIS just delegates it off, and then there's a little connection piece that's done in process to IIS that flips it off into your applications. So all your different web applications now, if you're in the later versions of IIS, have their own domain. You know, you build a virtual directory, that's your application domain. You can put services in there, you can put web apps in there. And then that becomes your web pipeline, okay, your ASP pipeline. So server context, you can cache it or you can construct it for each request, but the thing is, all we're doing is generally we got a request, we build up a subsystem, we generate a page, we dump it back, okay? Whether we post or we get, that's all we're doing. And sometimes we're going to redirect to a new place, right? To button click or an event is finished. Now if we're in the pipeline, coming from IIS, this is kind of the detailed pipeline. You've got yourself a runtime. There's one of these per app, and then you have multiple pools of pipes that are going on. An HTTP application is kind of the front end, and there's a set of modules. So authentication, if you're in Windows authentication, it comes from IIS. So you're already pre-authenticated if you've done web's authentication. If you're doing forms authentication, it goes a little bit down in the stack, but one of the first modules is your authentication module. You're not going to render a page unless you're authorized to do it. And that's where like MVC comes in with some of the attributes on this page quickly by saying, nope, you're not authorized. It does it on the authorization part of the module before it even sends the page back. Just said, it can't do it. One of those dreaded errors, right? In there, we can attach specific modules. If you want to, you can put in a custom module to do logging, right? You can do logging on entry, logging on exit. MVC has some quicker ways to do it. But you know, some of the filtering approaches, the global filters they talk about in MVC, are attaching in kind of the front end of the request and then the response in terms of seeing what's happening for context and things. And you ought to get used to that. Right now, I'm in an application without any logging. I'm sorry, but it becomes a real pain in the tail when you don't have nice logging to always see the request when you want it. Just turn it on, turn it off. And that ought to be one of the first things you look at. MVC can make it nice. Unfortunately, I haven't used it because I haven't had time to get into it, and it's not a priority. And at the end, you get the HTTP handler, and that's kind of the end of the chain. And by that time, you've created a page, you've got it ready, and you dump it back as a stream back to the client, and they do whatever they want to, and then they'll have another request. And it might go into a different pipeline. So you're going to have context. Remember, keeping the context in the database, keeping the context in terms of your shared piece here. That shared piece has things like your request information, you know, where did you come from, you know, some of the information in the request. You always have the user information, right? Are you an authenticated user or are you an anonymous user? If you're authenticated, what are your credentials? What's your authorization? And then you also have some session information. If you abuse that, you've got an awful lot of information coming back and forth on the system. So you really want to keep that light. So, you know, that becomes kind of the trick on how we're doing things always on our design. Okay, for Razor. The Razor View Engine was created for WebMatrix. WebMatrix uses IIS Express, I already said this, SQL Compact, is the Razor component. Quick and dirty, and it's a code-centric approach for humans. So the cool part about this is it's very easy to transition between HTML markup. You know, it looks like an HTML page with some @ signs and then code. So half of it looks like code you'd write in C# for any old application, and half of it looks like markup. And then knowing some of the quick transitions back and forth is all you really have to keep track of. And then the question is, what in the heck do you want to do with your code? Most of the time, you're going to use the code to grab something, let's say some data or persistent information from a server, so you can populate fields, or you can provide some information on the system. And there's mostly automatic conversion right now. You don't have to explicitly say, I'm in code, I'm going out of code. I'm in code, I'm going out of code. All you have to do is say, I'm in code, and it'll know when it sees a markup component, angle brackets in particular. It'll just go back. And with highlighting, you can normally just see where it thinks it should go back and forth. And you can fiddle around with braces and parentheses a little bit, and there's a couple of extra special things you can do. But after that, it's just code plus markup. And if you try and make it more complicated, you're doing way too much work. Okay, so it's an optional component. You don't have to use Razor with MVC3. You can use the old markup forms. If you want to translate an old MVC2 application, start up with pages that are just MVC2. And then later on, start changing some of your pages to CS/HTML files. CS is C# and then HTML, named right. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a quick little demo using Web Matrix, and it's not going to use SQL Compact, so I don't have persistence. I don't have this richness. I can't use helpers and things to generate pages, but just show you the mix between code and data and how Razor works. So if I can do this decently, yeah, that worked. I'm going to do it the hard way. Can you tell I can't see? Ha. Can you see this? This isn't quite as bright as I'd like. Here's an example of some Razor code. You will notice at the very top, there's some standard markup, doc type HTML. Notice that's just markup. Then I've got a code block. Ampersand is the thing that starts a code block. And if you have it with brace, open brace, close brace, everything within there is C# code. That's not too tough. So I'm defining some variables like counts 25, I'm doing a message, an escape message, a literal message. Ampersand means two things in Razor. And I did this deliberately. It almost always is a transition to code or a transition back from code. But it can also be a string literal. Okay, that can catch you. So that's one of those watch-its. So that last literal message with the ampersand in front of it is just a string literal. Nothing complicated, no Razor in there, but it's still something that Razor has to know about. Okay, if we have a little block of code like that, that's done in the beginning, right? I've just defined some variables that I can use someplace in there. I can sit there and I can display those variables. Traditionally, I'll use a toString. So if I actually want to have some markup and all of a sudden switch and take my variable and display it, and that's not that exciting, I can do that. All I have to do is say, like H2 for a header, and in the middle of the header, put a variable and there's a string with an ampersand, and it'll display, and it goes from markup to displaying the context. And most of the time, it knows if you're doing this inline kind of thing, that what you're doing is you're trying to take whatever value or expression you have, and you want to turn it as part of your string to build your markup. Okay, if you have a block, that's just doing stuff, right? We're setting up variables, doing computations. Maybe you can set up a whole view model. You don't want to put a lot of code in your CS/HTML. But this is just Razor. You can do almost anything you want. So you can program something. So then as we go down below, in my body, I have myself a loop. So notice in there, I've got a couple of different kinds of comments. One of the comments is a Razor comment. That kind of comment with the ampersand asterisk is a comment that doesn't go to client code. If you do an HTML comment, yeah, that can move over to the client side. So I would recommend the Razor comments almost always because they almost always work. And if in doubt, and if you're in Visual Studio, just go use the comment tool and it'll pick the right comment for you. Cool, huh? Don't have to think about it. So this is going to be one that's just going to do a loopy thing, and I'm just going to throw some text on the screen, but at least can show some code. So if this is pretty clear to everybody, it's not that terribly exciting, we can go run it. With a little change of this loop, we could done that fuzz buzz thing. Okay, so you notice we generated, this is a message. Wow, right? This is markup. That's all it is. This is HTML. There is no ASP stuff stuck around to the client. They don't see anything except straight HTML. You want HTML5? It's there. So this is just a loop that does some goofy stuff. And if we want to go and hopefully, I can look. Yeah, I should be able to look at page source. I did it twice. If you look at the source, that's not terribly exciting, but notice this is vanilla HTML. There is nothing in here. So you notice what we have, Razor's a templating system. You can use it outside of ASP NET. You can use it as a templating system to generate all sorts of things if you want to, and there are people who have done that, probably because they can. You're taking code from server-side things, you're stuffing it into the HTML and doing wonderful things. So if you think about these possibilities, this is the power of ASP NET MVC. But we're going to put a pattern behind it. We're going to have tools and aids behind it. But Razor's nothing, okay? Okay, I think that's enough on Razor. There's some resources I can point you to at the end of the presentation, but cool. So, yeah, do you want me to pop it back?
You're kind of selling us something new, but isn't this kind of the original way we used to do web development? We had code with markup. I mean, this strikes me as funny how we take something that.
But it's the Microsoft way.
Well, but we had and I'm a big fan of MVC. I'm just saying, I didn't know if maybe that's one of the pitfalls you might want to cover is because if you're sticking a bunch of code in there along with that markup, we're back to you might as well be just writing pre.NET ASP.
And if that was all it was, it would be a complete flop. So yeah, I agree. What's going to happen is there's a pattern to help you out, and there's a lot of aids to do this efficiently. Okay. Without those aids and tools, we'd be stuck into the dark ages. However, it's easy to fall into the dark ages and do some anti-patterns, but yes, it's not magic, it's not mystical.
The problem is he's showing web matrix, and it's web matrix, is not MVC. There are no controllers.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that.
You have to put the logic somewhere.
Well, you can do a few things. You can actually have a database backing, but I don't even want to get into it because it doesn't match what we're doing. But Web Matrix actually uses SQL Compact as the backing, does some things different from what I just showed. But it's a good way to play around with some web stuff and see the results fast. That's all I wanted to do.
I guess one of the things I would just be curious if we could cover is how much code in that part is too much code. That'd be something I'd be interested in seeing if you had an opinion on.
Strong opinion. The lightest you can make your code footprint in your view, the better off you are. I've done some things where I built view models on the fly and then used those to post into partial views because we had to. And it turns out there's no good solution for it right now, but that's kind of the edge of there weren't any helpers and I ought to make some helpers on this. The more code you put in the view, the more of a mistake it is because now you're starting putting things, potentially business logic. That's bad, okay? I think everybody agree that's really, really bad. So the intent is it's easy to do this, but don't. But right now for playing, it's good to see what you can do quickly. Does that sound like a decent answer to you? I mean, I have a strong opinion. Keep the view light in terms of code. But for populating server things, you're going to have to put in things. And mostly you want to do it with like a data type passed from like a controller. That's a better place for it. And the controller hopefully gets it from someplace else that's a nice encapsulation of your logic. So the controller's even thin if you can get away with it. It should do delegation of things and coordination of things. That should be a controller.
Did that hold up pretty well in practice?
If you do that, it holds up much better. The more code you even put in a controller, and instead of putting in the backing things, the less the code reuse opportunities you get. And been kind of fighting that because there's an issue of complexity in terms of where do you put the code. But a strong opinion is not in the view, but there's the hooks to do it very efficiently and very lightly. Okay, and then Also not as much in the control. You want to put in your model or a modeled service or a domain model, and that's that frontier area. Okay. So we got to see a little bit of Razor, and really that's enough to be dangerous right now, because I can summarize a couple of things in here, which would be good enough. Darn, I have no idea where I was last at. Any other questions? I didn't say stupid yet, have I? I will. Okay, Razor syntax then. We just saw an example of Razor, and I think if you look at it, you go, that looks pretty obvious. It's just code. It's server-side HTML, so you gotta be sharp on your old HTML a little bit or know what's generated, plus markup. So the purpose is to generate HTML from the client. So an example I have is, you wouldn't want to do this generally if it's strongly typed. You can pass things from view data, which is one of those things that's one of those states you have. There's view data and there's view bag. View data is a variant collection. View bag is a dynamic collection of items. Okay, and it has an issue in terms of when you want to do reflection for the binding parts. But there's a mix of just a header tag with some code just to populate something in there from view data. Now the helpers avoid us from going down to that level. We like to use the helpers because then it's in a habit, it's a form, everybody's been using it, and we can cut down on all the voluminous typing we'd be doing. One little quick thing to get you started, ampersand using near the top of your code allows you to put in namespaces. Cool thing if you need it in Razor, like if you're using a specific view model class or something that has its own namespace. Okay, also for Razor syntax, comments, ampersand asterisk, multi-line comments. You can do C# comments in C#. You can use HTML comments, which passes through to the client in the HTML part, but the Razor comments always work. I'd recommend that. Code to markup modes. Ampersand starts the C#, and it normally automatically transitions back. And if you do an ampersand with the braces around it, that's a code block. That gets executed early. Often if you do an ampersand with parentheses around it, that forces you to do an expression. So expressions usually turn into a stream to do something to dump into your HTML. Code blocks usually do your setup and things beforehand. And then if you want to, in the bottom line, there's a meta tag. Text in /text is the meta tag to explicitly force it back into markup mode. Yeah, I'm sorry, that looks lame. I've seen that and I hate it. If you do the ampersand : that forces you back if it gets screwed up. And normally if you set up your Visual Studio, you can set up Visual Studio and highlight what's Razor code not. And do it light enough so it doesn't drive you nuts. But then it becomes perfectly obvious if it's not going back and forth between markup and not without you having to think too deep about it. It's nice and lazy. So I'd recommend it. That's just a setting in Visual Studio. Okay, the model view controller. So we first got this idea about a view. Okay, we're going to pretend that there's a persistent layer. We're going to pretend that there's a database behind it or something, right? Because otherwise it's going to be a pretty boring web page. But now the whole idea is MVC, it's an MVC pattern. So what in heck are we doing with the MVC pattern, and how did it happen? Okay, Smalltalk started this out. Before the Apple, there was the Xerox. And the Xerox was great, and nobody knew how to sell it, so I think Jobs was actually there at Xerox and it became, I think he bought like one share. So he could show up to one of the meetings and he goes, cool, we'll go do that ourselves. So Microsoft didn't copy from it. Everybody copied from Xerox and they just gave it up. But they did some wonderful things. And MVC came out of the early work in Smalltalk from Xerox. Darn. Okay, so MVC came from that time, Model View Controller. It permits loose coupling between components, and it assumes persistent state. Okay, so if you have a view, the whole idea here is the view is the user interface. So like we talked about just before, we want to have the user interface stuff and nothing else. We want to have as little in that view as possible. All it does is just display stuff. That's all it's responsible for. The model shouldn't know about the view. The model's the state, the data, the business logic, the validation logic, all that junk behind that defines your application. And it might be, let's say, long-running tasks, because in ASP, we often have to do our state over a long time period. A model responds to requests. So if you think about this, our view can ask the model, what do you got? But it might be better if the controller asks the model and prepares the data from the model so the view gets it right, is a way that would probably be better. And it used to be one of the variances, the model used to be able to notify you. The models change, it would tell the view with an event callback. That's all you'd set up. Okay, then the controller in the original idea, if you can imagine way back when our phones right now would kick computers that were workstations at the time, setting up the state for an interactive environment was tough. And it turns out the controller was a piece of just super loop kind of code, just banging and banging and banging. And it responded to user input. So it set up and it read the events, and it manipulated the model, and it basically was the master to coordinate everything. So if we look at a picture, wow, you've probably seen this picture a million times, but the important thing is the controller would know about the model, the view would know about the model doesn't know about the view. If it ever does anything, it's going to be called back to the view to say, hey, I've changed, so the view could go re-inquire about data. The controller usually then manipulates the view, and then traditional idea is it would get user input from the view. If you think about ASP NET from what I described earlier, that doesn't fit our model, does it? Because we got a couple problems. First of all is when we got a view, it's over on the user side. Controller's on the server side. So the controller doesn't even have any view information left. It dumped it after it sent the information to the client. So we're not going to have the same kind of interaction, but this has been modified for web use very heavily over the years, and a lot of different languages have used this pattern. Before Microsoft, it's an effective pattern. Okay, so if we're thinking about the changes now, what's going to happen if you start from the left side, we get a request coming down from below, routed the app from the client. In MVC, there's a little piece in here that's real important, that's not MVC piece, and it's the routing engine. Where do you go? Because we're going to have multiple controllers. If you have one controller, you can do it, but it's just going to get all clouded up. It probably makes a nice idea to partition it into multiple controllers doing different things. The controller then gets the request, and it says, okay, what do I have? And then what do I want to do with it? You know, it could be a postback or whatever. And the controller is going to have multiple things it can do. Each one of those is called an action. So we have a controller. Different controllers do different things. Let's say manages users, manages login security, does some business logic. Each one of those might be some nice different controllers. So by setting up your address, we can route to the appropriate controller, and we can also use that same routing engine to say, here's the method we want to call, and in the controller we say, what do you want? And then the controller logic now, what it's going to do is it's going to talk to the model, talk to the database or service or whatever we have, and then it gets the information, depending on the data, we'll go build a view for you. And then that's just HTML. We're going to use the razor to build a view, then send it all back. So that comes back from the server. This is the process that's going to happen over and over. If it's a get, it does this process. If it's a post, it does this process. Doesn't make any difference. We're always building something up, looking at the data, seeing what we need, generate HTML, and throw straight HTML back to the client. That's it. So it's still a model view controller, but this is a controlling idea. The controller catches everything in front, and it's a little different from the traditional view, but we still have the nice decoupling, and it's the MVC pattern. So the router controller. There's a router in ASP NET. Right, is to say which application do you go to and all that other fun stuff that happens. And if there's a resource that's there, like you're trying to get to an image file or something, it says, cool, I found the image file, and it delivers it back. If it doesn't find a resource, then it goes to the routing engine in MVC, and MVC says, is this something I can understand? Is it within my routing rules? Can I find a controller and an action that matches this route? So if I have an about controller that just does some generic background information that has some sort of action on it, or I have a home control, whatever the name of the controller is, if I have an action that matches that path, then it goes and runs into the controller action, does its thing, generates a page or response. The response could also be something like JSON, right? You could just sit there and do a JSON result and squirt it back. But most of the time it's going to be view or a partial view or something. Okay. So this whole idea is we have routers that connect to a virtual path, and then it goes and talks to the controller. So it's always kind of the router to the controller, and controllers are just classes that implement the controller interface, or the controller base class. And what's going to happen is controllers have these methods. They're called action methods. And for every kind of route you're going to have for different things you want to do on the web page, you'll have different actions. Like your original display is often called index. Or you might have an edit display, and you can call it edit. Each one of those would be then your edit action or your index action. So if you have a home controller, home index goes to my main display. If I want to edit it, home edit, probably have to pass what I want to edit as also a route piece of data, like what index is going to be edited. That's really all we're doing here. So with the controllers, we're going to normally do your data access. You're going to figure out what you need to do, and by default, if your controller action name matches a view name of the same sort, it'll wire it up automatically for you. Cool. Okay, so by tradition, the home controller is the default, and the index is the default. So if you just go to your default website and don't do anything, it'll go look up the home controller, index action, and go try and run it. And that's generally set up on your web page with a nice little introduction. Okay, I will get to code soon. Views then is then this markup plus our C#, this HTML file. We'll have a bunch of them for everything we want to have for a view. And the controller usually is going to pre-process and set up the data from the server to say, you know, here's all the elements we want to display, maybe a list of things, or here's an index of an element that we need to search for and we want to edit, but pulls off that record and now has all that edit data ready to go in terms of some sort of type, as a model type or as a view model. We can also stuff in the view bag as unordered, but then we have to do all this stuff ourselves, keeping track of, you know, what input element corresponds to what view bag element and that mapping. Why? Okay, so strongly typed is going to be a key idea here. Controller is going to set up a type, so we're going to set up lots of different types to display the right stuff very quickly, and we can actually have you know, all the IntelliSense kinds of things so we can set this up quickly. Okay, so views compared to web matrix. We have view data and view bag properties. We can have a strongly typed model called model. And we have persistence store, you know, database or services to manage the dynamic data. Normally before you get into the view, if you're doing your database persistent stuff in the view, there's something wrong. And we just create the client-side pages, and we can use jQuery, which is not capitalized appropriately. Because right now, since it's straight HTML, there's no mangling or goofy things happening. We can use jQuery very effectively, and right now, jQuery templates are normally set up so you can do it straight out of the box in an MVC application. Okay, time-wise, yeah, I'm doing okay. Got to go a little faster. Quick is normally in layout, there's a view start. Whenever you build a page, you go to view start. So it's a place you can do your initialization code. Like if you need certain scripts you're going to use all the time, you can put them there. If you want to use the standard layout by default, put it in there. There's also an area in view called shared. It's a common view code that's going to be shared by everybody, and so you can have a master layout. And it's kind of like the master detail kind of approach before, but it's just a layout that happens, and it has a render thing in the middle, render body, that if you're using layout, that's where you shove everything inside. So you can now have menus and all sorts of fun things in terms of your superstructure, and you can have different layouts, just override your default layout. It works pretty well. So now I'm going to flip over to the tracker and see if I can do this a little more effectively. Yes. Show you a couple things really quick. You will notice on the right-hand side, now hopefully that's visible. Can everybody read it? You will see a couple of folders. One's called controllers, and we have a home controller. For routing, you don't worry about the controller. Is /home goes to the home controller automatically. So if there's a /home route, home controller. There's also right now a dashboard controller, and again, that's the dashboard controller without the controller name in terms of a route. you'll notice these are our controllers we can go to right now in the app. So it's not that big, but it's nice and simple. Convention here. If you use good habits, you don't have to do a lot of wire-up code. It's done for you. I used to remember some things with Java a long time ago doing some web things. You configure for 2 weeks and you hope you got lucky. And if you didn't, debugging was a stinker. That's what led into this. And a lot of these ideas have come in other places because of that same frustration. So they were just one of the places where you happened to bump over it earlier. Views now, you'll notice there's subdirectories. All views now should go in the view subdirectory by convention. If they match up the controller, life is good. So you'll notice for each controller, home controller has a views home. Dashboard controller has a views dashboard. And inside here, inside the dashboard, you'll see that there's a create, delete, deleted, edit, details, and index out of order. Well, guess what? You're probably going to have actions by default with the same name. You don't have to, but otherwise you're going to have to do an awful lot more typing. There's overloads in the controller to set up the right view. All you have to do is say view if you're in, let's say, the home index, and it knows to go to the home index view in that index folder. Cool. And there's little wizards. You just right-click and you can add views, and it'll do wonderful things for you. So you'll notice here we've got some habits then. Our habits are what make things work pretty effectively. So if we want to do this, home controller. Well, let's go into dashboard. We notice we have create, delete, deleted, edit, all that fun stuff. Let's go look at the dashboard controller really quickly. And in here, you'll see it, public class dashboard controller implements controller, which gives us a lot of things behind the scenes. And it has an action result called index. Notice how that matches up. We have an index action method that corresponds to an index view. So that's just a habit to go into. You don't have to think, just put it in the right place and things are going to work very well. And you'll notice here, all we're doing is we're going to the data through entity, grabbing some information about your tasks, and then we're going to throw into the view my tasks. This is a strongly typed view. And what's it passing across? My tasks, and since it is a variant type or the var type, it's an iQueryable task, which is defined in our model. So we have a model here with all our stuff, and it's off into this file. I'm not even going to search for it for right now. But now if we look at the index code, this is our razor code again, but now we've got our data. And a couple of things that are different from what we saw earlier. The first line we have ampersand model. This is our strongly typed data that we're sending across. And it's sending across a list, an IEnumerable, of fully qualified tasks. So we can actually have IntelliSense in here, and we have a view bag title, which really is kind of a waste of time right now. But you'll notice here we make a table. Okay, well that looks pretty generic. And then here's something that's a little bit different. For each item in model, we have an action link. So can anybody tell me what's happening here? It's not terribly tough. We have a collection, right? We have a collection of tasks. The for each is basically code. Notice how we're going between code and markup very effectively. All we're doing here is looping through, and we're making rows. And in each row, we have an edit, details, and delete set of action links that we're doing. And then we have item task type, item task status, and item name being displayed. So we're just populating the data in here. Cool. This also can be largely templated. You can use scaffolding, and if you have a strongly typed model and you have an entity set up, you just right-click on it. I may not have time to do this the way it's going right now today. And that's sad. I could show it to anybody who's curious about it, but this can be auto-generated just about for you. So if we go and look at this code, we have one task. Down below there was a link that creates new. And you'll notice my address here in the top. I'm in the dashboard route. Where's it going to? Dashboard index. If I go and edit this, First of all is if you look down on the bottom, when I hovered over this, that link is going to go into Dashboard Edit 1. That's telling me what my item number is if I want to edit it. Okay, so it turns out there's another thing in routing. By default, it's sending across an ID. So that's why if you have a list of like 20 or 30 items, you can know which one you're trying to edit. And that's being sent back. When you're doing your binding, on your binding, whenever you create a page or get a page back from the server, there's a binding step. And what it does is it matches all the stuff on the page and all the elements on the page with your view model and your view bag data. And if it finds a name on the view bag and it finds in the model, you could be in some trouble. So you normally want to have unique names. That's one of the things to watch out for. Or if you use like structures, you know, have a structure type so everything's clear by reflection on which element you're looking at. But then it's not that terribly difficult. Well, we can create a new task. And now we're on that dashboard create markup field. And we can type some stuff. Yeah, I'm good. Status. Oops, I didn't even get a description. I'm going to create it without a description even. It didn't like me. Okay. You notice what happened? My database is read-only. Shame on me. Okay. I'm not going to try and fix that right now, but I would assert that if the database wasn't read-only configured right, it would update it, you could go see it. But we're seeing enough of what we care about right now. So right now, most of what's happening is an elaboration on a theme. You notice how I'm trying to get through smoothly something that just crashed and burned. Okay. So right now there's a script section. You can put jQuery in here and set it up. One thing I want to show, very important on this, is in your web config, you know, config here isn't terribly weird. Handlers. If you remember that idea of the handler stack, near the top here with the handlers, you can actually add and remove handlers into that web processing stack for processing. So you can do all sorts of customization if you want to. That has nothing to do with MVC. MVC can do those kinds of things if you want to. You can often set up your database stuff here. The other thing, though, to care about is global.asax. This is the setup when the application runs. And you'll notice register routes. Nothing special about that. Register routes is just a method that they made in the template just because they didn't want to put it all in the startup and keep it separate. But you'll notice here that our routing system, our route component, has a map route in terms of how things are done. It's done as controller/action/ID, and it has some things that are optional in there in terms of like the ID's optional. And it sets up a routing hierarchy. There's a whole piece of literature in there to see how routing works. Silverlight is surprisingly similar in terms of how its routing engine works. So if you learn it in one context, you'll learn it in another. You can make this as complicated or simple as you want, but if you can use the stock behaviors of routing, you don't have to change this. But this is kind of the core of how you configure it. So if you want to move routing where a controller goes someplace else completely or remaps completely, you just change the tables of routing here. Lots of orthogonal little ideas. Okay, well, enough of this quick little discussion. Going back onto it, now I got to go through a few slides. Nope. HTML helpers. I want to do this real quick. I glossed over a few things, but you saw a bunch of those things that HTML dot, you know, there's things like edit for, display for, radio box for, and things like that. What they do is they generate markup. And they're kind of cool because instead of doing a lot of complicated work, you use these little helpers and it'll do all the busy work for you pretty much in the right way. And you can make your own if you want to. So also talked about this. You have this idea of a model being passed across. You have view data, you have view bag. You also have your context with things like your requests and things if you want. But that's going to be usually your data transfer kind of place. Everything else is going to have to go to a service or a database, or you're just going to have to let it die. And we're going to then have things like dynamic helpers. If we don't want to have strongly typed, if we want to use that view bag, view data kind of thing and just stuff things in, anything you want to, and then go suck it back out, then we get to use these things like HTML label. display a label. HTML list box. Now, label is important because it defines the identifier of what you have, and it helps in reflection to match things up. You can have list boxes, text areas, passwords, radio buttons. You can have HTML hidden. That's important. If you send something to a view and you care about it and there is no element there in the view, when it comes on a post back, it won't retain that value from the last one, in which case you've lost it. Fairly important. So HTML hidden is a wonderful piece to keep for things like GUIDs or things. I would recommend GUIDs instead of straight IDs on this, because if you're passing, let's say, imagine you're a company. You have all sorts of companies registering to you, and you find out, oh, I'm company number 23. What happens if we just fudge and throw in company number 24? Pretty good odds 24 exists. If you do it with a GUID, much less chance to fudge a GUID for something like that. So for simple security, if you're just passing it, notice a lot of things are coming across as clear text. Strongly typed helpers, the only difference is you have list box 4, and you're doing a little linkish thing there, where you normally set up, you know, like the model goes to the model dot what element in the model you care about, and you can use that for display. Nice part is huge amount of code is dealt with. I want you to key, though, quickly on BeginForm. We're doing straight HTML. So if you're doing a post back, you know, or you're doing data entry, we're actually using the HTML form mechanism. We're not using any fancy ASP stuff. We're using straight a form. So this using HTML.BeginForm, action name, controller name, post, you can do form method post or form method get. All we're doing here is we're going to generate a form tag and a slash form tag. And the curious thing is, how do you make the slash form tag? What happens is open brace builds the object. There's a dispose method on this thing. Close brace, when it closes up, it automatically disposes, in which case it creates the inform tag. So you don't have to do anything goofy on there. It just does it. And so then inside you put all your elements. So your labels for, your editor for. We could go into this in lots of detail. The other thing, though, that's kind of goofy that you might not be used to is you can pass in HTML attributes to almost any of these controls. So you can pass lots of data back and forth if you want to for an overloaded idea of calling something. So the HTML helpers can include these attributes, and you build them on the fly. And this is the idea of like new value equals 127, ampersand class. Ampersand is not a terribly good character to use in C#. If you try and use that, you'll find out it barfs a lot. So it turns out, or sorry, class is not a very good identifier to use in C#, right? It's a keyword. So ampersand class, sorry, is the magic way to just say, well, we're going to have to do translation. We're calling it class, but we're going to be able to deal with this in general C# by doing a special markup form. So this was really just saying values 127, class is equal to my new element class. We built a dictionary on the fly. And we can do this very easily, and this is done on a lot of the examples that you will see. And if you're uncomfortable with this type of syntax, you're just doing a name value collection. That's all you're doing. And it's used an awful lot in examples, and if you're using things like Telerik ever, they use that massively. Okay, the other thing is bindings. I'm going to go real quick. Elements on a page, gets and posts are bound when they're sent or received. You can also explicitly call a binding step. It generally binds to the model, binds to the query string. So if you have a query string in there with 4 or 5 name parameters, guess what? It can find those names, it can bind if there's an appropriate thing that matches. And if it doesn't find anything that binds that matches, it says, yeah, I don't know what to do, and it barfs. So we can also bind to route values, in particular the ID. And you can have more complicated routing mechanisms if you want to set it up yourself. And it binds to view data. And if it's view bag, and if you don't cast things, view bag is this new dynamic type, right? It's kind of like the old Python kind of idea is dynamic types. If it's not known at compile time, the binding really doesn't like you. So binds by name, so it'd be nice to make sure you keep names simple but unique. And it's normally not that hard, but you might get caught once in a while. Okay, I was going to demonstrate scaffolding, but I'm going to assert because of time that we could sit there, and if we have like an entity in our entity data set ready to go, you go and you can make a new controller, you just right-click in the controllers directory, and you say add new controller, and the option is if you make it a strongly typed approach, and if there's an entity that matches, you search for the entities, find the right entity that matches what you want, and it can develop a whole CRUD set of views for you, and it'll build a view directory for you, and all the views for you automatically, so it does the edit and the delete. So the things you saw before with like the edit delete that didn't work, it's going to do all that code for you, and most of the time it's going to work out of the box, which is wonderful. Generally, the first thing you want to do is then go muck with the code, but it gets you up and running quick, and it gets you with workable entities. And if you have things with like many-to-many kinds of linkages, and if it's in the entity model correct with the chain down, it all works. Okay, for time, how many minutes do I still have?
Is there a limit?
Oh, I'm not going to go past an hour if I can. Are we right there?
7:55.
Whoa. I'm going to let this all go today. It would be a wonderful discussion. The whole idea of this discussion, well, I'm going to do what I can do in about 2 minutes in case there's any questions. There's a couple wonderful patterns that fit with Entity, fit within ASP NET MVC that you really, really ought to give a good look at. And there's an example, the Contoso application on the web. You can find it, you can download it. It runs SQL Compact, but whoop. It will go through and it shows you very simple implementation of repository and unit of work. So repository mediates between the domain and the data. It basically takes databases, and on the other side, when we're trying to program, it gives you a collection of objects is what it's really doing. Now if you just pass an queryable, darn, then it's just passing SQL across, in which case, what the heck are you doing? So it provides an interface so we can look at data's objects, and then the backing, it looks at all the changes and such. So you've got a context, and then your context, if you save changes now, you now have a transaction, right? You make all your changes, you then update things. If you want to revert, well, you just lose your context, start over again, and then you're back where you were when you started. You probably have to update your view, but you have the whole idea of transactions now in a fairly easy form. But it turns out that setting up a repository into a common place gives us that translation. So then we're going to deal with collections of objects. We're going to have ways to get items and such. Unit of work pattern is the other side. You put repositories inside your unit of work. Why? You'd like to be able to deal with all your different objects, right? If you're doing 3 or 4 different things with different entities, you'd like to do them as a single entity. And unit of work controls that. So when you're all done, repositories do stuff. Unit of work saves the changes when you're done. And unit of work holds the repositories traditionally. If you make them as properties, you just go get the properties off the unit of work and you go play with them with link queries or whatever you want to do.
And plus, you should mention too, that way all repositories can share the same context, which is, that's absolutely.
Well, you need that for the transaction. And that comes out of the box automatically without even thinking. You just follow the pattern that's there. It also gives you an interface, a good interface layer, so you can separate all your data stuff from your operational application stuff. So if you ever change your data layer, you now have a good abstraction. It's the place to do it.
Right, and then you can, I mean, the other thing too is it makes it a lot easier to test because you can make an interface for the unit of work and then you can just inject it.
I would love to talk about dependency injection and all those other things, but guess what? I'm out of time.
Yeah, right.
Okay. For anybody who's curious about it, I could show you the unit of work and some examples. It's really, really easy. If you want to see it, it's in Contoso application. Now, the only thing I want to warn you about is like 120 pages, lots of pictures and of how to do it in Visual Studio. Contoso starts with straight data and keeps changing and eventually gets to unit of work and entity. And it turns out that I believe the schools, there's a schools repository and a unit of work. That's kind of the end pattern where you're going to. So if you read through that example, you should have a pretty good handle on a very simple unit of work and repository that's done fairly effectively. It's a generic repository. So imagine you have a generic repository with a standard method. You have the queries to find things, and then when you're all done, you stick them in unit of work. But since it's typeless, every type you want can use that same pattern, and if you want to, you can inherit from it, right? You inherit from your generic repository type and add the extra methods you want. It's nice, it's easy, it's simple. Okay, so the unit of work holds the context. So you can keep it and flush it and shared, like you said. And you have a save method. Unit of work should do the save. Sometimes people stick it in your repository just as convenience, but that's not always the best. And then you got your collection of repositories to do your different things, you know, your tables and such. I was going to go through an example, and I'm not going to go into the argument, but the argument was going to be, where do we put our behavior? Because what's going to happen is there's something called anemic domain. And if you're not careful, and if you just follow all the documentation, which is wonderful, and follow all the Microsoft prescriptions, and you think about it, you can actually have all these objects with services on top, and it turns out you're making a transaction pattern, which is stuff that was around many years ago, and you did all this wrapping to do things in a very old way, which is kind of a waste of time. In which case, you also have an encapsulating use object richness. So that's the good discussion that I would love to have with some people, because there's no great answers on this, but it's finding the right place of where to put your behaviors and separate behaviors and objects and how much you put in those objects. Because POCO objects can have lots of behaviors if you want to. Becomes the idea of what can make a successful project that's very easy, or one that's basically just coding the old way and having complexity all over the place, and it's a pet peeve of mine. So hopefully I told a story. What I'd like to recommend is there's some links for Razor. This is going to be posted. The links are wonderful. There's a book on Razor. It turns out the book on Razor talks as much about web matrix as it does on anything. So just use the online. Razor's too easy. ASP NET though, there are two books. That Galloway one is a wonderful book. If you really are serious about it, that's the one I'd recommend. Both books are good, but the first one is heavier duty. And there's a simplified version on the web. The music store example has a 120-page PDF or thereabouts, which is kind of a cut-down version. But the real meat, it turns out the people who worked on this are actually a lot of the heavy-duty developers and managers at Microsoft. And the two examples, Contoso, I'd recommend heavily, and even Music Store. Online videos, you name it. There should be enough information. So today, the intent was to show you it's not so bad, to give you the context, and I was going to show you where things are going or some of the limits, but we did run into time. So, any questions? Okay, Alan, you're up.